So you're repping, pay to education, at least one. Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Yeah. That's good. Yeah. Okay. Not quite the same as not quite San Diego or Malibu, right? So you anticipate a move coming? Wow, that's good though. It's exciting. Yes. Yep. Sorry, Mason's my girlfriend who's in California. How are you, David? Good. I'm good. Okay, y'all ready? So I'm like 10 minutes behind schedule already, so listen fast. I'm going to talk fast. I need you to listen fast. That is the beginning of a bad day. Possibly. So, we're doing Psalm 16 today. But I'm not going to take it off, no. It took a lot of mental effort to get it on. So there's a story of a guy who was a traveling salesperson. He's on this lonely stretch of highway or road, and kind of pavement ends, and he has a flat tire. So he goes to change it, and he opens up his trunk, and he remembered that he had taken his lug wrench out at the house when he was packing, and he didn't put it back in. So he was a bit distressed, and he sees a farmhouse half mile up the road. So he decided to go to the farmhouse and ask if they had a lug wrench that he could borrow. And so along the way, as we sometimes do, he began to think about all the possible scenarios that might happen when he knocked on the door and asked for one. So this was his thought process. He said, well, I may knock on the door and they won't even answer because of who I am. And then, well, if I do knock on the door, they could be mad because I interrupted dinner or family time. And even if they opened the door and they had a lug wrench, which they may or may not have, they probably wouldn't let me use it. And so he came to the conclusion as he was walking to the farmhouse that the family there was nothing more than selfish, irritated, old and cold, and wouldn't help anyone if they asked. And so he got to the house and he knocked on the door, and a voice calls from inside and said, "Who's there?" And the salesperson replied, "You know good and well who it is and what I want. It's me, and you can keep your stupid lug wrench. I wouldn't borrow it from you if it was the last one on the earth." So I'll tell that story to say perspective makes some kind of difference in life, doesn't it? How you anticipate things and what you expect will have a direct input sometime or on the outcome of things. And Psalm 16 is somewhat like that. So I'm going to give you a new Hebrew word to put in your cadre of Hebrew words that you can start conversations with at the dinner table. So Psalm 16 is known as a miktam. And a miktam is an unknown designation. It's probably musical, probably has something to do with that, but it also could mean that this is an inscription for something to be written. This is to be written on something. So there are 6 of these miktams in the Psalms. Psalms 56 through 60, and then Psalm 16. In 4 of the 6, miktams have a designated historical setting that are associated with David and being delivered from some trouble. And if you want to go ahead and read those while I'm talking, if you're bored, that's 56, 57, 59, and 60. all have in the inscription, this happened when David did this. That's not the case in Psalm 58 and Psalm 16. But here's what we do know, and I'll give you where I think it is in just a minute. David had a different outlook about trouble than most of us do. David experienced a lot of trouble, especially early before the death of Saul. Remember, he's on the run, and he gets put in some bad situations. But what David did, David expected God to be God. In other words, David didn't expect when he knocked on the farmhouse that he was going to be turned away or told no. There was a certain expectation of God that David had. And I think Psalm 16 exhorts us in its own way to look and expect God to be God in life, in spite of what life looks like around us. If you like to categorize Psalms, good for you. This is called a trust psalm, I think. And I want to read it to you. This is from what's known the Jewish Publication Society's translation, which is the translation of the Tanakh, which is the Old Hebrew Scriptures, not the Masoretic text that we use for our text, but some of those older ones. And so this is Psalm 16 from the Jewish Publication Society translation. Protect me, O God, for I seek refuge in you. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord, my benefactor. There is none above you. As to the holy and mighty ones that are in the land, my whole desire concerning them is that those who espouse another God may have sorrows. I will have no part of their bloody libations. Their names will not pass my lips. The Lord has my allotted share and portion. You, God, control my fate. Delightful country has fallen to my lot. Lovely indeed is my estate. I bless the Lord who has guided me. My conscience admonishes me at night. I am ever mindful of the Lord's presence. He is at my right hand. I shall never be shaken. So my heart rejoices, my whole being exults, and my body rests secure. For you will not abandon me to Sheol, or let your faithful one see the pit. You will teach me the path of life. In your presence is perfect joy. Delights are ever in your right hand. Let's pray. Keep me whole, O Lord, for I've resolved to make my home with you, as you, though inhabiting eternity, have stooped to make your home with me. See how I have bet everything on your word or promise that you are good, trustworthy, true. I thank you for the fellowship of the redeemed, the raucous symphony of the saints, this patchwork quilt of grace, stitched, frayed, but as one. Their faith gives me strength. Together we limp toward the kingdom. This world is teeming with idols, false messiahs, promising temporary shalom in dollars, swagger, and flesh. Their victims become shadows of their former selves, emptied at the altar, poured out like wax. Lord knows I've been there too, more often than I care to admit. But my heart, weak as it is, clings to you, O God. Are you not more than enough for me, my Lord? Do you not provide all that I need? Your hands feed me, your spirit renews me, your blessings make me rich, and you add no sorrow to it. In your mercy, you light my path. You speak to me in the stirring of my spirit, in the flutter of my heart, the chill of my spine. Though I have run from you, you remain ever present, faithful, a friend, a trusted guide. I have no fear of the grave or the sundering of my spirit from you, for you have washed me in your blood and clothed me in your holiness, and I will live to see the world made new. You have shown me the way which I must walk, and you choose to walk it with me. The cheer of the damned is a thin draught next to the richness of your table. The lust of the flesh are a scanty meal, while the joy of the righteous is an endless feast. In your name forever. Amen. So we got a lot of talented people in our church. So I'd ask Chris, amen, to lead some songs today. And I was talking to Chris and Leslie, and I said, well, what do you got on Psalm 16? Here's what I got. And Leslie said, yeah, I'll just write one. So I'm going to get to that in just a minute. So Chris is going to, let me give you the setting of where I think this is. So throughout 1 Samuel, the latter part of 1 Samuel, after David is anointed in 1 Samuel 13, and then he goes and fights Goliath in 17, and then after that, Saul and he which were once close, become enemies. And David is constantly on the run. Saul is jealous of David's power. Remember in chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, God's already told Saul through Samuel, your kingdom's going to be taken away from you. And we've already anointed a new one, and David was the new one. And so there's this series of back and forth, and Saul's put a bounty on David's head, and he's chasing him. And so these other psalms that fit into this miktam, 4 of them I said give us some background. This one doesn't, but just by process of elimination, I think this is probably the one in 1 Samuel 26, where David is on the run again. Samuel has died, and Samuel's been David's protector. And so in 1 Samuel 25, Samuel has died. David is wandering in the wilderness of Ziph, and Saul has 3,000 soldiers looking for him. And so Saul is in camp, and David sends spies to verify the position of Saul's tent. And then he enters the camp with a servant by the name of Abishai, and they find Saul. And David has an opportunity to kill King Saul while he's asleep, but he doesn't. What he takes from Saul while he's there is a spear and a water jug from Saul's tent. And he leaves the camp unnoticed, and the text tells us because God, he calls a deep sleep to fall in the camp. And so when people wake up, David gets away from the camp, he gets up on the hill above the camp, and he yells out to Saul and Abner, who is the commander of Saul's army. And David begins to question Abner's ability to protect his king. Looky what I got, right? I'm sure that's not exactly how he said it, but maybe. And so Saul recognizes David's voice, because remember, David would sing to him and calm that distressing spirit that King Saul had. And there's a dialogue then that happens between Saul and David. Saul confessed sin, and David acknowledged that Saul was God's anointed, and he would not take out God's anointed. That was God's work, not his, which is why about the 3rd time he doesn't kill him. And he vowed not to harm him, and then Saul blesses David verbally. And this makes sense to me that perhaps this is the time frame in this kind of moment of rest before Saul dies and before David takes over, that David is credited with this psalm and not being abandoned by God. So I asked Leslie about the psalm, and so she just wrote one and finished it yesterday and taught Chris. And Chris is going to teach us today. So we're just going to work through it. And if he says, nope, we're going to do it again, we're going to do it again. Right, Chris?
Well, I'm just going to try to sing it.
Or that.
The wonderful thing about Psalms and singing Psalms is it turns into the story that it was into our story, right? And I think this is a song. And singing. Oh, keep me safe, my God. I take refuge in you. I said to God, you are my God, Lord. I have no but you. As for your saints on earth, they are the glorious ones.
That's talent. So, what do you expect when life stinks? And life does stink sometimes. And for David, who'd been on the run for a while, it was tough. It's tough. Listen, it's tough enough when you have your enemies that you know that are after you, but those that you love and that you're connected to and you had a relationship with and that you protected. It's hard when the oppression and the stress comes from them. Where do you turn? And where David turns is where David often turned, and that is to God. And so in the first two verses, David uses three terms or three words to identify God and to acknowledge the reality that it's God who he needs to turn to in spite of the present circumstances. And so in verse 1, he uses the very common word Elohim that we see, which is normally translated God. And often Elohim is associated with the Creator God. That is what God is called in Genesis 1. And that God has power, and God is in control, and as God speaks, things happen. And so when he leans into that acknowledgement of God's powerful and eternal nature, that God has always been, and that God has always been in control. In verses 2, he uses the first part of verse 2, Yahweh, YHWH, which is always Lord, all caps. When you see that, that's Yahweh is really not how you pronounce it. And as I've told you before, if I try to pronounce it in Hebrew, I'd have to spit on you, and then it wouldn't make any sense anyway. So it's an unpronounceable name known as a tetragrammaton. But Yahweh is the covenant name. It's the personal name of God. And so the first place David leans into Elohim, God is powerful, and God is eternal. And then the second, David acknowledges that God is close, and he's relational. And so you see the same kind of language in Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. It denotes there's a closeness or an immanence that God has, and so he feels nurtured and protected by God. And then in the last part of verse 2, David uses the word Adonai, which is usually translated Lord, but just capital L, not all caps. Adonai can mean master, but I think what David acknowledges is there is a position that he holds in relationship to God, and that is God is in control, and God is in control of him. And so as God has anointed him to be the next king, in spite of all the trouble from Saul, that what he recognizes is, I need to stay with God. God is the master, and God has the control here, and if I do that, then God's going to see me through, going to give me the results. And so you get powerful God, relational God, positional God, if you will. And as David leans into that, there is an expectation then that God's going to be God for him. That God's going to live into those names as he's identified. And so what David understands is, one, he's never removed from the power of God. God's power is close and really there. He's never removed from the immanent personal God, and he's never moved, what he says then, from the goodness of God. Because he says nothing good, right, comes apart from you. And James says this in a different way in James chapter 1, that every good gift comes from the God of heaven above, right? And then he kind of leans into what David says, from whom there is no shadow of turning, right? God doesn't change. His character is consistent, nature is consistent. And so what David expects is, this is who God is. God is powerful, and God is present, and God is a provider, and what he can expect is something good to happen in the midst of this conflict with Saul. And if you read, if 1 Samuel 26 is actually the context, which it makes sense to me, what good happens? David says, I'm not going to kill you, and Saul says, I'm going to bless you. There's this little respite, I guess, of the conflict that's there. Some good comes from that because God is God. And so we can expect, when life stinks, and life does stink sometimes, that God's still powerful, that God's still near, that God still provides, and that God still cares. Not that. All right, you probably know this one. Lord, you are more So what do you expect when life stinks? What about people? What do you expect of people? So in the next section, 3 and 4, David talks about people. Right? The saints in the land, the holy ones, the ones who are set apart. They are excellent or mighty or of good report. They're in whom I delight. Then there are others, right? There are sorrows of those who run after other gods, and their sorrows shall multiply. And David can't embrace them or take their names on the list, on his lips. I think it's easy for us, maybe mentally, to say, when life stinks, I expect God to be God. But what do you expect of us? What do you expect of me? What should I expect of you? I lost a loved one. What should I expect from you? Or what do you expect from me? I lost a ton of money in the market. That's probably the truth, right, over the last few weeks. What do you expect? I'm going through a divorce. What do you expect? My kids won't talk to me. What do you expect? Somebody at church hurt my feelings. What do you expect of everybody else? And what David, I believe, now listen, Saul, that's his people, right? He's married to his daughter. What do you expect of people? And you know, when I think about 1 Corinthians 13, what I ought to expect of you is the best. Right? My default should be not the worst, but the best. And unfortunately, I think sometimes our default is, well, I'm going to expect the worst and then hope I'm pleasantly surprised. Right? Is that right? That's easier to take, isn't it, than I'm going to expect the best and be bitterly disappointed. And I think what David is saying is, look, there are people that I expect things out of, and I'm going to assume the best out of them. He calls them God's holy ones, or God's set-apart people, God's sanctified people, people who have, right, God's name written on their heart or under the covenant of God. And I think what Saul does too, David does, even in the Saul midst. Look, he had these 300 people that traveled with him, his warriors. He expected them to stand up and protect him, and they do. But I believe he really expected Saul to come to his senses, if you will, to have some kind of reconciliation and conciliatory attitude toward him. And you know what? I guess if you expect that enough and you show that and you believe that, what happens? It may come to fruition, right? I mean, Saul's been a madman after him, just singularly focused. I think he would have rather been, right? He would have rather have defeated David and got rid of David than beat all the other armies of the world. And David just keeps showing him grace and showing him mercy and expecting more out of him. And it took a long time. I think he finally gets it. If 1 Samuel 26 is where the psalm takes place. And we ought to expect, we ought to expect the best of each other. We should. It bothers me, and I've given into it. This is confessional time, so I'm going to rant on myself today. It bothers me that we've become so skeptical and cynical about each other, that we build these walls of protection so that you don't disappoint me and hurt me. Isn't that true? I mean, that's just our world, and it's bothersome. I do the same thing. Listen, if I expect nothing of you, I certainly won't ever be disappointed, right? And as you know, is, let me put this, as confident as I appear and unflappable about stuff, I don't want to be disappointed with you. And I don't want you to be disappointed with me. But if I expect the worst out of you, that's really not God's way. Listen, I may not be disappointed. That's not God's way. That's not what love does. Is it? I expect you to be Jesus' people. That's what I expect, right? That's what I should expect. That you're going to be Jesus' people. Okay. Will I be disappointed sometime? Yeah. Are you disappointed in me sometime? Yeah. Hopefully not every Sunday, but some Sundays I get it. Right? I get it. Sometimes I'm really disappointed in me on Sundays. And more so on Monday through Saturday. But what we should expect from each other is mercy and grace and compassion. That's what we ought to expect. The benefit of the doubt. I mean, listen, we've been doing this dance a long time, church. You and I have, right? Some of you, you were here from the beginning. 16 years of this. We ought to be able to expect the best of each other. Some of you hadn't, been subject to my shenanigans as long, but we ought to be at that point, right? We get the benefit of the doubt. That our intentions are considered to be pure. And even if it goes against your radar goes off, then maybe, hey, okay, you can still expect the best of each other when that happens. And I believe David is trying to get that out. Look, and then he says, but there are those who are chasing false gods, right, who have made an idol out of something. And we're good at idol making. And we don't make it out of metal and wood and stuff, but we make it out of ideologies, or money, or education, or position, or reputation, or whatever it is that we make an idol out of. And David says, yeah, there's sorrow. But I think David feels sorrow for them too. Not contempt, but sorrow for that. But he says, I can't play that game, right? You have to know where I am. So I have ongoing conversations all the time in this community with non-believers and people who, have a different ethic and don't. Right? Listen, this is where I am. And but the fact that I don't approve of you or you don't agree with me doesn't mean that I don't love you. It doesn't mean I can't even learn from you. What it means is, look, these are my boundaries. And these I believe are where God put boundaries, and I can't cross them. Right? I can't cross them. And sleep at night anyway. Listen, sometimes we do. But I think we can expect the best. And look, and we can be encouraged by each other. And look, I think we can also be anxious about each other too. And David doesn't deny that. But I think there's an expectation that he has of God's people to be God's people. And that helps him, by the way. And that's more than the 300 or the 600 that ran around with him, depending on what time frame it is. And so what he does, expects that. And he also expects in this that God's principles and God's ethic are the guiding ethic that we must adhere to. And that God's going to be fair and just with that, and that God's going to deal with evil on God's terms, not on ours. David, listen, if you think about David could have taken out Saul multiple times. I mean, he was the chosen one, right? That's what he was. The anointed is what it means. The chosen one. But you know what he said? That's not my doing, God. That's your work. You do it. And you let me know when it's done. That didn't happen until 1 Samuel 31. Expect the best of each other. And then as we read on, I think where David expects God to provide a lot of things, and that's why he's unshakable. So the Lord is my portion and my cup, and he holds his lot or his destiny. The lines, and he said that could be boundaries for me, are in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. And I bless the Lord, he gives me counsel. In the night also my heart, he instructs me. And I have set the Lord always before me, for he is at my right hand, and I will not be shaken. He trusts God to provide and protect and to lead and to guide. And he understands that his ultimate inheritance is not stuff on this earth. Right? It's not. And look, I hope your kids and grandkids, you leave them something. Good for them. But what's more important is not the stuff that has monetary value. It's what you leave in their heart. Right? It's what the legacy that you pass on that's not attached to material goods is the one that's important. And David recognizes that. It's what God gives him. And look, and God gave him the kingdom, and God's going to give him some riches, and God's going to give him power. But that's not where David found his hope. That's not why he's unshakable. Matter of fact, even if you look when he becomes king, his reign as king is a myriad of trouble, isn't it? I mean, there are people after him all the time, and there's that whole Bathsheba thing, and there's his son Absalom, and I mean, it just goes on and on. I mean, he is a dysfunctional mess in the palace. And he's not unshakable in that way. That's not where he finds his confidence in what God has promised. And again, I think it has nothing to do with him being king, and everything to do with him being chosen by God and being a follower of God. I think the same could be said of us about, so we work so hard to control our own destiny, don't we? I am the captain of my own ship. You don't even own the ship. Right? I mean, when's the last time everything worked out just like you planned it? Although I will say, last night for Ryan and Mackenzie's wedding, it's the first wedding, so I didn't officiate. Maybe it's me. So nothing went wrong. Nothing fell, no wrong words, right? No stumbling over the vows. Nothing went wrong. Well, I guess we'd had a little bit of glitchy microphone for about 2 seconds, right? I don't know. But you think about that. We try so hard to control our destiny and our outcome. And you know what David said? That's God's business. That's God's business. And I'm going to let God work it out. And how God works it out with David is to guide him. And I think starts here. He guides his mind and his heart, which is why he doesn't take Saul out, and why he runs, and why he just gives. It seems like he abdicates the throne when Absalom revolts against him. Right? And he weeps bitterly when Absalom dies, and when this whole thing with Bathsheba comes out, and Nathan comes to him and confronts him. Right? He's trying to control all this stuff. And when he doesn't, and he lets God do it, he is a different David, isn't he? And that even in the Bathsheba incident, when Nathan tells him the son's going to die, and David gets at peace all of a sudden. Strange, right? And it's when that line we use a lot of times about seeing people later, that he said, he can't come to me, but one day I'll go to him. And it's like this peace came over him when he quit trying to control everything and let God do it. Because God would guide him and guide his thoughts and minds. And that's what gave him confidence. And so that's why he said, I can be unshaken. Because God provides, and God leads, and God guides, and God corrects, and God builds me up, and God will take me down when I need to be taken down. And God will send Nathan to me when I need a Nathan. And God will wake me up with my kids like Absalom, or it's what he does. I trust God. And at the end of the day, I think that's what he's saying, that I'm unshaken because God's going to provide. Okay. We'll see.
Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, help me stand.
So what's David expect? David expects God to be present. Beginning in verse 9. Therefore my heart is glad and my whole being rejoices. My flesh dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures evermore. You know, I talk a lot about the presence of God, and I don't want those to be just words. And I say that for me, not for you. I don't want those to just be words. I believe God is present. I believe God is here. I believe God dwells within us. I believe God is in the elements. I believe God is in baptism. I believe God is in us. I believe God is in this world in places that I can't even imagine where God will show up. And I have to believe that, by the way. If not, then I'm in despair. Because the world stinks most days, right? It does. A lot of days it's just awful. And that's why, I just listen to, you start listening to all the stuff and you just go, man, are we not a messed up place? True. But God is present. And I think God is sometimes more present in the mess than he is in the calm. And where's God more needed? In the middle of the mess. And so David was able to rejoice about the presence of God in trials and in triumph on earth. And so one of the things that is kind of replete throughout the Psalms is that there's value in suffering, there's value in trial. And you've heard me talk about our therapeutic world. We want to feel good and be comfortable all the time. We pay, no offense, Curtis, we pay doctors a lot of money to make us feel good. But sometimes it's the feeling bad that brings us closest to God. It's being uncomfortable. It's being in pain. It's being in grief, having sorrow and experiencing trial and hardship and rejection, where God becomes the most real to us. And so we don't need to discount hardship and suffering. There's value in it. Sometimes it's good not to sit in a cushioned chair, but to sit on the hard ground. Sometimes it's good not to be in an air-conditioned building, but to sweat. And you'll walk outside, you can do that today, but sometimes it's for our own good that we suffer loss, because it brings us to God. Look, and the hurt's still there, and the pain's still there, and we get that. But what David says, and he talks about Sheol, and Sheol's the realm of the dead. And so here's how an Old Testament professor describes Sheol to me. It's a shadowy place with a gate that only opens inward. It's like the Hotel California, right? You can check out, but you can never leave. Except God can get you out of there. And God's the only one who can get you out of Sheol, out of the realm of the dead. And so David, I think, even understands that. Even in death, God's presence will be there. Even in the grave, God can take me out of that, which certainly comes true. So Psalm 16, by the way, is not considered to be a messianic psalm. It's not a psalm about Jesus until Peter on Pentecost decided that it was. Because he quotes from this in Acts chapter 2. And Paul quotes from this in Acts chapter 13. And what he says is, look, what David said about coming out of Sheol, Jesus has proven to you that God is present even in death. That he would not allow his Holy One to face corruption. And he brings him up from the grave. So this is a messianic resurrection reference that I don't think the Jews really intended that to be messianic. But as Peter begins to think about and what the Spirit puts on his heart, and Paul too, yeah, this is a Jesus psalm in a most powerful way. And there's a prayer in this psalm that I think for us is for God to be present in every decision that we make. And this is in verse 11. That God can be revealed, that God will provide the pathway that is a standard of behavior of life. And even though that path could be narrow and difficult, it is one that is life-giving and abundant. And the prayer is, right, God, show me the way. So, this is a question I get asked. Well, how do I know? Sometimes you get to a fork in the road, right? Where do I turn? You're listening for God, you're asking for... Sometimes we don't know, so we just go. And then God will correct, or God will keep dragging us down the road, or God will pull us in a different direction. If we're open to God's leading and what God's doing, and maybe have to listen a little bit for God's voice, and that may come from all kinds of sources that we're not thinking about, right? It could be a guy named John Whittle who calls you up and says, "Hey, how about moving to Marble Falls?" I don't think so. That's what I said the first time, right? Then it may be a guy named John Whittle who you call back and go, "Hey, about that no." Yeah, come on. Here I am. And John didn't have to answer the phone that day. Oh, it's Greg calling again. I'm talking to him. Yeah, and the elders didn't have to say, "Yeah, come back, can we talk again?" Right? I came to a fork in the road. I chose poorly the first time. Maybe. But you know what? I think it worked out. Right? I think it worked out. Sometimes we don't know. But the prayer is, and I think a constant prayer we ought to have, is we expect God to give us directions. By the way, I think I'm going to finish teaching that class on hearing God. I'll have to start all over because I already forgot what I told you. And then I only did it for like 3 weeks before COVID hit. Listen, here's one thing I figured out. If God always agrees with you, it's probably not God telling you what to do. Right. Okay, I'm just saying. I've learned that the hard way too. Because what David says, in your presence, he finds joy. And at his right hand, the right hand is the hand of power. There are delightful things that never, ever go away, in spite of what's going on around you. And it's the presence of God that's really powerful. And look, sometimes we deny that presence, or we don't look for that presence, and sometimes we manufacture that presence too. I get that. But church, I'm telling you, I think God is here right now. I think God's going to be here at 2 o'clock this afternoon when we say goodbye to Dolly Montgomery. And God's going to be in Odom, Texas tomorrow at 11 o'clock when we bury her. And that God is in the hospital right now, and God is with surgeons right now who are preparing for surgery on some of our people who need surgery. And God was present with people who had surgery and had to go back to the hospital, right, Jeff? And got to come back. Listen, God is present. And God, by the way, God is present whether we acknowledge that or not, and whether we can see that or not. And part of this guidance in finding the path is to help us be aware. I think one of our prayers every day ought to be is, God, what David's was, make yourself known to me. By the way, God's not afraid to do that. I mean, revelation is what God is all about. All right, and that brings security. And you can expect that from God. Expect the best out of God.
In His presence, there is comfort. In His presence, there is peace. When
So you've probably read the story of the lady who wanted to be buried with her fork. Have y'all heard that story? Well, that actually happened to me. Before I ever heard the story, she had read the story. So the very first funeral I did, I had been doing youth ministry for about 3 or 4 months, and one of our church members passed away, and our preacher was out of town, and the family asked me to do the funeral. And she wanted to be buried with 2 things: a Dallas Cowboy hat and a fork. Okay, so the Cowboys, you know, it was they had just been on that run of Super Bowls with, you know, Aikman and Emmett and Michael Irvin and that group. And she thought, well, maybe that would keep going, right? She's a big Cowboy fan. The second one, she told me, the family told me the story about the fork. And the fork was, remember, at home, you know, especially sitting around the table and especially at Grandma's house, what she always said, keep your fork. Why? Dessert's coming, right? The best is yet to come. And so I think with God, when we start thinking about what do we expect, is keep your fork, right? No matter how good the steak was, and steak is really good. That red velvet cake with buttercream icing, or that pecan pie that you get every year on your birthday from a sweet lady who makes really good pecan pies, right? Man, that's the good stuff. And I think, church, what David is trying to say in this whole song is sometimes life gets really difficult, and trials are great, and people disappoint you, and you wonder what in the world's going to happen next. And what he says is keep your fork. Because with God, the best is always coming. And ultimately, this whole mess that we call earth is going to be done and be redone, and whatever that's going to look like, whatever the afterlife looks like, it'll be better, right? Even if it's good right now, it'll be better. But I'm going to give you an exhortation. You don't have to wait until the afterlife to experience the abundant life. Because Jesus said in John 17, eternal life begins now when you believe on him. Right? It does. That means the good life is already here. And I'm not saying the good life can't get better, but the good life is already here. And when we recognize that, we can expect the best of God and of each other and the best outcomes. Because I believe what Paul said, that God's working together for our good when we love God and are called according to his purpose. Y'all go home. But come back at 2 if you want to, if you are able.